Republican Senator from Iowa, Joni Ernst, is feeling the heat from MAGA Republicans over her hesitancy to back President-elect Donald Trump's pick for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Ernst signaled on Thursday that she is not ready to support Hegseth's nomination.
Will you support his nomination?
Well, I did have a very long, lengthy discussion with Pete yesterday, and I do appreciate his service to the nation. I also am a combat veteran. So we talked about a number of those issues, and we will continue with the vetting process. I think that that is incredibly important. So again, all I'm saying is we had a very frank and productive discussion, and I know that we will continue to have conversation in the upcoming months.
It doesn't sound on your answer that you've gotten to a yes. If I'm wrong about that, correct me. And if that is the case, it sounds to me as if the hearing will be critical for his nomination. Am I right about that?
I think you are right.
Ernst made a name for herself in the past by championing legislation aimed at addressing sexual assault and harassment in the military. She herself served in the U.S. Army Reserve from 1993 to 2015 and retired as a lieutenant colonel. She has been outspoken about her personal experiences with sexual assault and violence in the military.
For years, the military has struggled to reduce the number of sexual assaults within the ranks, yet we have seen little progress in defeating this scourge. The stories from survivors are heartbreaking.
One user on X called Ernst despicable. Also popular right-wing influencer DC Drano, that's quite a handle, posted, "How about the first thing we cut is all the American money you keep sending to Ukraine?" And podcast host JD Rucker chimed in, "As long as your plan includes confirming Trump's nominees, especially Pete Hegseth, then I'm sure it's fine."
Hegseth is continuing in the fight for defense secretary despite being embroiled in allegations of sexual misconduct and alcohol abuse. Despite her comments on Fox News Thursday, Ernst took to X shortly after that appearance to tout her support for a meeting she was attending with Trump's Department of Government Efficiency co-chairs Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They are discussing plans for slashing the federal budget. She posted, "I'm excited to host the first Senate Doge caucus meeting today. I'm sharing my plan with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to reduce waste and hashtag make 'em squeal." Earlier this week, Ernst pitched a $1 trillion federal spending cut to the Doge co-heads, and as head of the Senate Doge caucus, Ernst has been eyeing doing away with work-from-home policies and released a scathing report on Thursday citing widespread instances of abuse and failures from telework practices. So you win some, you lose some, I guess, for Joni Ernst. She's obviously getting a little bit of that street cred back with her work with Doge and Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. I think people were really excited about her report talking about telework practices. A significant amount of the federal government is still work from home. I think it's fair to say that if you're getting a taxpayer-funded salary, maybe you should go into the office. I don't know, maybe you feel differently about that. I'm sure there are some hybrid situations for some employees that are fine. But yeah, she's taking a lot of heat for her position on Pete Hegseth. People are not happy that she is holding up potentially his nomination. She's obviously not the only one on the Republican side who has concerns about some of the allegations that came out. But I think the Senate only has a limited number of vetoes on Trump's nominees. They used one on Matt Gaetz. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to force out Pete Hegseth in favor of Ron DeSantis, as some outlets have been reporting, but we'll see what happens.
Well, I think it's interesting, first with Joni Ernst, there have been some people in the MAGA world who are starting to threaten a primary challenge. We're not quite there yet. I would say she's still relatively politically safe in Iowa. And I think that her concern here is pretty genuine about her, first of all, her background in the military as a reformer around sexual assault in the military, which has been a great, an important bipartisan issue over the years. And I think she's genuinely troubled by Hegseth's background, and she's trying to basically signal her opposition to him without getting totally called out by Donald Trump and the MAGA base. There have been some people who've even floated her name for Secretary of Defense. I think that makes her critiques a little bit harder. In the past, you've seen senators who've torpedoed different nominees, but not necessarily putting themselves up to replace those nominees. And one thing I noticed yesterday with Pete Hegseth is had this headline talking about, I will commit to not drinking while on the job, which is never a good day if that's the headline about you. And so I think Hegseth himself is inviting a lot of this criticism. Now, moving to the Doge area that she's been commenting on, it's very interesting. Like you said, I think that she's regaining some of her credibility on the MAGA side by really leaning in to that issue. I do think there's some important nuance required when it comes to the telework policies. On one hand, do I doubt that there is some abuse of telework policies happening across millions of people? There are many millions of people who work at the federal government, many who take advantage of telework, yes. But on the other hand, many people who choose to telework for the federal government and various agencies have to make the case that their telework is helping to save the federal government money. And so if the interest here is cutting spending with the federal government, there are efficiencies that you gain with telework, and I think that's getting missed in that story.
Yeah, I guess that's fair, but then the question would be as well, are you doing your job as well at home? And also, are you, you might be, I mean, I guess, how would you be saving money, though, from teleworking? Because do they pay for transportation or parking or?
Yeah, well, part of it is the cost of living is higher in Washington, D.C. than it is in many other parts of the country. So the compensation is indexed for the cost of living of your area. So if you're working in like my home state of Wisconsin, for example, you're getting compensated less than if you were based in D.C. So that's part of the rationale for the cost savings. Now, the other part of the story, though, is Doge and Joni Ernst, they're talking about calling everyone back in, cutting these telework policies, partly because it's going to cause attrition in the federal government, right? You know, and I totally get your point that I'm a big like work in the office kind of guy. I'm big into building a team culture. I think culture is the most important determinant of success of any organization. And so I totally take that point, but the problem with the attrition argument is that you're going to lose some of the most talented people working in the federal government. You want to be able to keep your talented people and fire the people who are not doing as good of a job. This kind of across-the-board cutting and using the telework policies as a way to just randomly cut people, that's not a way to enhance the culture or enhance the talent of your organization.
One of the other ways that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have talked about this cost-cutting analysis of federal employees based on the cost of living adjustments you're talking about is actually moving some departments to places in the U.S. that are cheaper than Washington, D.C., which is potentially another way to get around that issue of teleworking potentially saving money for people who live outside of the Beltway. I wanted to go back to this Pete Hegseth question with Joni Ernst for a moment. I do think the headline that you're talking about was that he wouldn't drink at all when he was Secretary of Defense, not just when he's on the job, which is a little bit different.
Yeah, that's right.
And I do think that...
Still not a good news day.
No, not a good news day. I mean, it hasn't been a good news day for him for the past couple of weeks. Some of the allegations more concerning than others, some with better sourced material than others. But he's been on the Hill for the past 4 days now, talking to senators face-to-face, and I think that's going to be a big part of Trump's transition team generally, is actually getting them FaceTime with the senators, going through the confirmation hearing process. I think people are actually going to be pretty surprised by how competent and experienced a lot of these picks are. There's sort of been this overarching narrative that if you haven't worked in government before, then you don't know what you're doing and you can't lead these departments. As long as you're surrounded with people who do know the ins and outs and the culture of the department inside the government, as long as you have, I think, an idea that's consistent with Trump's vision, the vision that the American people voted for, then that shouldn't be disqualifying just because you haven't worked in a department before.
We definitely need people with new vision to change things. I think there's a lot of corporate capture of agencies. I'm very sympathetic to nominees who want to help, for example, close the revolving door from, let's take the Defense Department, for example, huge revolving door between senior officials at the Defense Department and then joining the military-industrial complex and lobbying the Defense Department. So that's a huge issue. Another piece of the story that people need to know about, however, is those surrounding organizations just on the periphery of the defense industrial complex have a ton of power. There's so much money to be made. And I think part of what's happening with Pete Hegseth is they don't respect him, and they are helping to leak a lot of these stories or seed stories of different news organizations to basically assassinate his character. And I think it just is another reminder of how powerful those organizations are. Now, going back to the federal agencies going out across the country, I think that's really fascinating, because I think part of the problem we have right now is a lot of people in power are highly concentrated in a few areas, particularly like Washington, D.C. It's an issue for the government and politics. It's also an issue for the media, by the way. Why is it that nearly every reporter I've worked with lives in New York City and Washington, D.C.? There's a whole rest of the country out there. I've spoken previously on the show about how shows like The View should consider relocating to the Midwest. I think that would really help them reconnect with people. And I think a similar principle applies for the federal government.
Totally agree. I mean, when you're living in one of the wealthiest enclaves in the country with a very different culture from most of the continental U.S., that's a problem with making policy, is being generally out of touch with the American people. We're going to have to move on. We're out of time on this segment, but we're going to be back with more Rising after this.